The mule had given up before the woman had. That was the first thing Harlancourt noticed when he crested the ridge above Bitter Creek Road, the grey mule standing perfectly still in the center of the rutted trail. Its head hanging low like a man who'd received terrible news, and behind it, a wagon listing hard to the right where the rear axle had cracked clean through. The left wheel was buried to its hub in the late October mud, and the whole contraption sat crooked and sorrowful against the mountain backdrop like a broken sentence no one had finished writing. The woman behind the wagon wasn't crying. That was the second thing he noticed. She had both hands pressed flat against the wagon's gate, pushing with everything she had, her boots churning the mud, her breath coming in hard white plumes against the cold morning air. The weight of her belly visible even through the heavy woolen coat she wore. Pushing a wagon that would not move. Had not moved. Would not move with 10 of her. The mountains above were the color of iron filings. The aspens had already gone gold and were beginning to let go of their leaves in long, slow drifts. The sky offered no warmth, only light, pale and thin as watered-down milk, and the wind off the high peaks carried winter in it, the kind of cold that announced itself like a reckoning. 2 children sat on the wagon seat. A boy of perhaps 9, holding the mule's lead line with the concentrated gravity of someone performing the most important job in the world. A girl younger, maybe 6, wrapped in a quilt and watching her mother with enormous, quiet eyes. Harlan pulled his horse to a stop on the ridge. Looked down. Looked at the sky. Look back down. He clucked his tongue and began the descent. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. He didn't say much when he reached her. Men like Harlancourt rarely wasted words on situations that were already plain enough. He dismounted, ground-tied his roan, walked to the rear of the wagon, and crouched down to look at the axle. The crack ran through the wood like a fault line, sudden, violent, the kind of break that happened when a wheel found a submerged rock at just the wrong speed, at just the wrong angle. There was no temporary fix for it. No amount of wire or rawhide or prayer would hold that axle under a loaded wagon through another mile of mountain road. He stood. Looked at the woman. She was looking back at him with eyes the color of deep creek water, green shaded toward gray, and they held something in them that wasn't weakness but had lived next to weakness long enough to know. It'd smell. She was perhaps 28. Perhaps older. Grief added years in ways that sun and wind could not. Axel's gone, he said. I know it, she said. Where you headed? She paused just a breath. Cresswell. I have a deed there. 40 acres. My husband's name is on it. Another pause, smaller. Was. He looked at the children. The boy had not loosened his grip on the mule's line. The girl had pulled the quilt tighter. Cresswell's another 11 miles, Harlan said. Uphill most of it. I know that too. He looked at the wagon. Back at her. At the sky, which was beginning to make promises it intended to keep before nightfall. Get in my wagon, he said. He jerked his chin back up the ridge. I've got a flatbed up the road. We'll load what matters. Anything that won't fit gets cashed and I'll come back for it. She studied him the way a person studies a contract they're not certain they've read all the way through. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed. My name's Harlancourt. I run the cord spread, 8 miles north of Cresswell on the Blackthorn Fork. I'm known thereabouts, if you need a vouching. Ruth Calloway, she said finally. These are my children. Thomas and May. The boy, Thomas, gave a single solemn nod, as though accepting a formal introduction at a church social. The girl, May, said nothing, only watched Harlan with those enormous eyes. Pleased to know you, Harlan said. He turned back to the wagon and began unhitching the mule. His spread, when they arrived to it in the failing afternoon light, announced itself as a place that had been kept rather than loved. The fences were sound, the barn roof patched, the stock tank clear and full. But the house sat at the center of it all with the quiet neglect of a thing that had outlasted the person who'd cared about its windows and its porch boards and the flower box that now held only dead stalks and compacted dirt. Ruth Calloway stood in the yard and looked at the house, and Harlan watched her face for what it would say about it. It said nothing. Or rather, it said, "I have seen worse than this. I have been worse than this. You can stay tonight," he said. "Morning, I'll take you on to your deed." He carried their things inside, 2 trunks, a crate of kitchen goods, a wooden box that Thomas carried himself and would not surrender to anyone. Harlan did not ask what was in it. The interior of the house smelled of old wood smoke and dried sage and the particular loneliness of rooms without voices in them. There was a cook stove in the kitchen, iron and substantial, and beside it a cord of split wood that Harlan had laid in for winter. There were 2 bedrooms off the central room. He told Ruth to take the larger one, put the children in the second, and made no ceremony of it. "You'll take your own room?" she asked, not unkindly, but with a kind of careful precision. "I'll bunk in the barn," he said. "I've done it before." She nodded. Then she looked at the kitchen, and something shifted in her, some calculation happening behind her eyes, and she said, "I'll cook." "You don't need to." "I'll cook," she said again. Quietly but with finality, and Harlan understood that this was not an offer of courtesy. This was a woman re-establishing the particular dignity of usefulness, and he had no right to take that from her. He brought in the crate of kitchen goods without being asked. What she made from what she found in that kitchen was the kind of meal that only happens when someone who knows hunger cooks for people they intend to keep alive. There was salt pork in Harlan's larder, and dried beans, and a sack of cornmeal, and wild onions she'd had Thomas fetch from the creek bank where she'd seen them growing in the last light. She rendered the pork fat first, slow, until the kitchen smelled like something remembered from a better time. She added the onions and let them go soft and sweet in the fat. Then the beans, reconstituted with hot water from the stove reservoir, and seasoned them with what little she had from her own spice tin, a palmful of black pepper, dried thyme. A whisper of something dark and smoky she didn't name. The cornbread she made in the iron skillet, getting the grease smoking hot first so the bottom crust came out the color of bourbon, crackling when she tapped it with her knuckle. Harlan sat at the table because Thomas had, with enormous earnestness, pulled out the chair for him and gestured to it as though seating a dignitary. May had found a rag and was wiping the table's surface with the methodical determination of a child accustomed to having chores mean something. When Ruth set the food down, Harlan looked at the table, the steaming pot, the skillet of golden cornbread. For tin plates she'd washed and stacked, and something moved through his chest that he didn't quite have a name for. It had been 3 years since anyone had cooked in that kitchen. 3 years since Eleanor had. He looked at the table and he did not let any of that show on his face, but he was quiet for a long moment before he reached for the serving spoon. "Thomas," Ruth said, and the boy folded his hands and bowed his head, and said a blessing over the meal in a voice that was trying very hard to be a man's voice and was only partway there. They ate. The children ate the way children eat when they have been genuinely hungry, steadily, without conversation, with a focused sincerity that was both heartbreaking and reassuring. May broke her cornbread into a precise grid of small pieces before eating it, one square at a time. Thomas ate his beans from the outside of the bowl inward, as though following a system. Harlan watched them without appearing to watch them. "It's good," he said to Ruth. "Simple. True." "It's what was there," she said. "Still good." She looked at him across the table, and for just a moment something in her face, that careful composure, that watchful holding back, softened by the smallest degree. Then she looked down at her bowl. "My husband built in Cresswell," she said, after a while. "He went ahead of us. Said he'd have the house framed before we came." She broke her cornbread. "He got the frame up. Then he died of the fever. August. I didn't find out until late September. The fire in the stove ticked. The wind moved against the window glass." "I'm sorry," Harlan said. "I know," she said, with the tone of a woman who had received so much of that particular sentiment it had worn smooth as river glass. He didn't push. They finished the meal in silence that was not uncomfortable but was full, the way a room is full after something significant has been said in it. Even when the most significant things have been left out. In the morning it was Harlan who was up first, banking the cook stove back to life, setting the coffee on, and going out to the barn before Dawn had fully committed to the idea of itself. When Thomas appeared at the barn door an hour later, hands in his coat pockets, Harlan didn't send him back inside. "You know horses?" Harlan asked. "Some," Thomas said. "My papa kept 2. A bay and a spotted mare." "You know how to muck a stall?" "Yes, sir." Harlan handed him the fork without further ceremony. Thomas worked steadily, without complaint, moving the soiled bedding with the particular efficient rhythm of a child who has been given real work and found it preferable to being treated like a burden. Harlan watched him from the corner of his eye while he replaced a worn leather strap on the harness and said nothing for a good while. Then, "Your mama. She have any people in Cresswell?" "No, sir," Thomas said. "Just the land." "Land something," Harlan said. "Papa always said so." Thomas paused in his mucking. "Said a man without land is just borrowing his place in the world." Harlan looked at the boy. "Your papa was right about that." Thomas went back to work. After a moment, "Are you going to make us leave today?" Harlan set down the harness strap. "I told your mother I'd take you to your deed when you're ready to go." "That stands." Thomas nodded, very slowly. "She's not ready yet," he said quietly. "She won't say it, but she's not." Harlan looked at the boy for a long moment. "All right," he said. He picked the harness strap back up. May found the stray cat on the second day. It appeared from somewhere beneath the porch, a lean, orange, deeply suspicious animal that May cornered near the water barrel using nothing but stillness and patience and half a biscuit she had been saving from breakfast. By the third day the cat was sleeping on her feet at night, and May had named it Persimmon, and that was that. Harlan discovered this when he came in for the noon meal and found Persimmon installed on the rag rug by the stove with the sovereign assurance of a creature that had always lived there. He looked at the cat. He looked at May, who looked back at him with those enormous, waiting eyes. "Cat earn his keep?" he asked. May said with some gravity. "She earn her keep." May considered this with great seriousness. "She killed a mouse this morning. I watched her." "All right then," Harlan said, and went to wash his hands, and May exhaled a breath she'd been holding for longer than she knew. 40 miles south, in the river town of Dalton Crossing, a man named Cabe Weiler was eating a late breakfast at the hotel and reading a letter for the third time. He was not a large man, but he carried himself as though he occupied more space than he actually did, the way certain men do, men who have found that aggression is a kind of architecture. He had a thin beard going to grey and eyes that moved constantly, always measuring, always calculating what something might be worth. The letter was from his lawyer in Cresswell, and it concerned 40 acres on the Blackthorn Fork that had been deeded to one James Calloway, now deceased, which Cabe Weiler had been attempting to acquire for the better part of a year through a combination of legal pressure and the quiet, persistent harassment he'd perfected over 2 decades of pushing smaller men off land he wanted. The letter informed him that James Calloway's widow had, apparently, arrived to claim the property. Cabe Weiler read this information, set the letter down, drank his coffee, and stared at the wall for a while. Then he called for his horse. He rode at no particular hurry. Men who operate through systems, through lawyers and proxies and the slow mechanical pressure of institutional weight, rarely hurry. Hurrying was for people who reacted. Cabe Weiler planned. There was a difference, and the difference had made him comfortable and had made other people uncomfortable, and he had found this arrangement satisfactory. But he rode north, steady and patient and inexorable as a season changing. Cresswell on a weekday sat quiet in the mountain valley like a dog that hasn't decided yet whether it's friendly. For blocks of business storefronts, a church, a mill, a livery, and a post office that also served as the land registry and, on alternating Tuesdays, the magistrate's court. Harlan drove Ruth and the children in on the flatbed, the morning cold enough to see their breath, the children in the wagon bed wrapped in quilts. May holding persimmon inside her coat so that only the cat's orange head was visible. They went first to the land registry, where a Mr. Fenwick Hobbs, a precise, dry man of 50 with the energy of someone who deeply enjoyed the management of other people's paperwork, examined Ruth's deed with the focused suspicion of a man who found irregularities personally offensive. "This is in James Calloway's name," Hobbs said. "James Calloway was my husband," Ruth said. "He is deceased. I have his death certificate." She laid it on the counter. Hobbs examined the certificate with the same suspicious focus. Then he looked up at Harlan, who was standing slightly behind Ruth's shoulder. "And your interest here is what, exactly, Mr. Cord?" "None of your particular business," Harlan said, pleasantly. "This woman would need to file for transfer of title. I know the process," Ruth said. "What do I need to file?" Hobbs's gaze drifted between her and Harlan with the barely concealed calculation of a man assembling a story he found more interesting than the facts. "Well, there's an affidavit of widowhood, a witness attestation, and the transfer fee is $4. He paused. "There's also the matter of Mr. Weiler's competing claim on the mineral easement over that same parcel." "What claim?" Ruth asked. Hobbs had the look of a man who had let something slip and was deciding how much to make of it. "Mr. Weiler filed a mineral easement claim in September. He argues the Calloway deed contains an ambiguity regarding subsurface rights." Ruth was very still. "There is no ambiguity in that deed. Mr. Weiler's lawyer argues otherwise." Harlan stepped up to the counter. "File the transfer," he said. "Today. We'll address Weiler's claim separately. The deed is clear and the woman is the rightful heir and she is standing in front of you with documentation in good order. File it." Hobbs looked at him for a moment, then looked at the paperwork, then quietly pulled out the correct forms. The difficulty, as Harlan had known it would be, came from a different quarter. Cresswell had a Mrs. Aldine Pruitt, who was the wife of the town's largest general merchant and had appointed herself the keeper of its social architecture with a thoroughness that would have made a general envious. She found them at the dry goods counter, where Ruth was purchasing lamp oil and a spool of heavy thread. And she descended on them with the specific energy of someone who has been saving up a conversation. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, having clearly done preliminary research on the subject. "I understand you've been staying out at the Cord place." Ruth turned. "I have. Mr. Cord was kind enough to assist me when my wagon broke down. Several days now, I understand. My wagon axle needs replacing. Mr. Cord has been good enough to allow us time to arrange matters." Mrs. Pruitt's expression arranged itself into something resembling concern while conveying something considerably more like judgment. "Well, a woman in your condition, alone on a man's property." She let this sit in the air. "People will talk, you understand. Not that I," she added, with the alacrity of someone who absolutely did, "but others less charitable, Mrs. Pruitt." Harlan had come around from the hardware section of the store where he'd been examining axle stock. He came to stand beside Ruth, not in front of her, not shielding her, but beside her, which was a different thing and mattered. "I believe you have a general store to manage." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes moved between them with frank, busy interest. "I only mean to say that a young widow, living alone with a man who, the Mrs. Calloway is not living alone with anyone," Harlan said. "She has 2 children with her, and she is on her own property by deed and by right, and what arrangements she makes for her family are hers to make." His voice was level and quiet. The way a man's voice gets quiet when he means every word with his full weight behind it. "If you've concern for her welfare, I'd suggest you direct it toward practical help rather than practical gossip." Mrs. Pruitt drew herself up. Her husband, from behind the counter, looked at the ceiling. Ruth set her money on the counter, took her goods, and walked toward the door. At the door she paused and looked back at Mrs. Pruitt with something that was not unkindness but was complete indifference to her opinion. "Good day," Ruth said, and went outside. In the street, the cold air sharp with pine resin and coming snow, Harlan loaded the goods into the wagon while Ruth stood with her face tipped slightly upward, eyes closed, breathing. Just breathing. "Thank you," she said, without opening her eyes. "I've known Aldine Pruitt 20 years, he said. She's never said a useful thing in all of them." Ruth made a sound that was nearly a laugh. She opened her eyes. "It won't stop, you know." "The talking?" "No," he agreed. "Probably not." She looked at him. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, which she noticed. "Not particularly," he said. "Does it bother you?" She watched Thomas and May through the store window, where Thomas was examining a display of pocket knives with the reverence of a museum visitor. "I've been talked about before," she said quietly. "When James was sick. When he died. When I stayed instead of going back east to my mother's." She paused. "I am still here." "Yes," Harlan said. "You are." They drove home in the last of the afternoon light, which lay over the mountain valley like old honey, warm in color but carrying no warmth at all, and Thomas fell asleep in the wagon bed with his head on his arm. And May held persimmon against her chest, and the cat purred with the complete self-satisfaction of an animal that has solved all of its problems. The first frost came that night, and with it, a sound. Harlan was not a heavy sleeper. He hadn't been since Eleanor, since the year she took sick, and he'd learned to listen for her breathing in the dark, and after she was gone he went on listening out of habit. Out of a vigilance that had nowhere left to go. He slept in the barn on his bedroll and he woke at the sound of the horses shifting. Horses shift for many reasons. Wind. The settling of wood. A night bird. He lay still and listened, sorting through the sounds the way a man who has lived alone in a mountain wilderness learns to sort them, cataloging, identifying, releasing the harmless ones. The horses shifted again. Both of them. Together. That was not wind. He was on his feet with his rifle in hand before the thought was fully formed, moving through the barn in the dark without a lantern. Knowing every step of the floor's layout the way he knew the lines of his own hands. He went out the back of the barn and came around the far side of the house, moving along the fence line in the shadow of it. The moon was 3/4 and bright on the frost-white ground, which was useful but cut both ways. There were two of them. He could see that much, two shapes near the back of the house, near the window of the bedroom where Ruth slept. One was crouched, doing something to the window latch. The other stood back, watching the road. Harlan came up behind the watching man and put the barrel of his Winchester against the back of the man's neck. "Don't," Harlan said. Very quietly. The way the word meant more when it wasn't shouted. The man froze. "Tell your friend to step away from that window." The watching man, Harlan could see now he was young, lean, someone's hired trouble, swallowed. "Dex," he said, barely above a whisper. "Step off." The crouching man stood and turned and saw Harlan and the rifle and went very still. "Who sent you?" Harlan said. Not a question. He already knew the shape of the answer. He just wanted them to confirm it. Silence. He pressed the barrel slightly harder. "I will ask once more and then I will stop asking and start deciding." "Weiler," the lean man said. "Weiler sent us." "To do what?" A pause. "Scare her off. That's all. Just scare her. Loosen the shutters, leave a note. That's all." "That's all," Harlan repeated. The two words came out carrying a great cold weight, like river stones. From inside the house, there was movement. A lamp lit in the central room. Then the back door opened and Ruth stood there in the light of it, her woolen robe wrapped around her. A cast-iron skillet held in both hands with the competence of a woman who knows a cast-iron skillet is not a joke. She looked at the two men. She looked at Harlan. She looked at the skillet and then back at the men, as though reconsidering whether she still needed it. "You're all right," Harlan told her. "I know I am," she said. Harlan looked at the two men. "Here is what will happen. You will walk back to whatever you rode in on and you will ride back to Cabe Weiler and you will tell him what I tell you to tell him. You understand?" The lean man nodded. "You tell him, Harlan Cord says this land is spoken for. The deed is filed and the title is transferring and no mineral claim on an ambiguity that doesn't exist is going to change that. You tell him any man who comes on this property uninvited and in the night will be dealt with as a trespasser and I will be entirely within my rights." He stepped back, lowering the rifle but not setting it down. "Go." They went. He listened to them move through the dark until the sound of hoofbeats retreated south down the creek road. He stood in the yard for a long moment in the frost and the moonlight. "You should go back inside," he said. "It's cold." "So should you," Ruth said. "I'll stay out a while." She stood in the doorway, and the lamplight behind her made a silhouette of her, the robe, the belly, the skillet still in her hand, and she said, quietly, "Thomas heard. He was already up when I got up. He went back to his room when he heard you had them." Harlan said nothing. "He asked me this morning," Ruth said, "whether you were the kind of man who stays." The frost glittered on the fence rails. A horse stamped in the barn. "What did you tell him?" Harlan asked. "I told him I didn't know yet," she said. "But that it was looking favorable." She went back inside. He stood in the yard another hour, watching the road south, until he was certain the night was going to keep its peace. Then he went back to the barn and lay down on his bedroll and stared at the dark ceiling above him and made the kind of decision that doesn't announce itself as a decision but simply arrives. Like a season, inevitable, already in motion, merely waiting on you to notice it. The next morning he was at the breakfast table, at Ruth's patient insistence, no longer taking meals in the barn, when he said what he'd been thinking through in the night. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. Ruth was at the stove. She didn't turn. "All right." Weiler's claim. He's using the easement as a wedge. As long as your title is contested, even a bad contest, he can keep a lawyer working at it. Tie it up. Make it expensive. Make it exhausting. He folded his hands on the table. He's done it before, with the Peterson parcel and the Rome Creek homestead. Both families gave up inside a year. Ruth turned from the stove. She looked at him steadily. "And? Weiler's got money and a patient lawyer. You've got a clean deed and the right on your side, but right and money don't always move at the same speed." He met her eyes. "There's a way to make this harder for him. Considerably harder. Tell me." He was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating. Choosing his words with the care of a man who has measured them for a long time. If the title transfers to a married woman, or a married couple, Weiler's easement argument fails entirely. His arguing the deed's ambiguity stems from the original grantee being male and now deceased with no clear legal heir until the estate transfer completes. But a deed in the name of a living, married property owner has no such ambiguity. His whole argument dissolves. The room was very quiet. Thomas and May were still asleep. The stove ticked. "You're talking about a legal marriage," Ruth said. "I am." "To you?" "Yes." He looked at the table. "I understand that. I want to say plainly, I am not asking for anything beyond what would protect your land and your children. I am not asking you to feel anything or pretend to anything. I have a house that needs a family in it and you have a family that needs a house. Whatever else might or might not come of it, that's nobody's business but what time makes of it." Ruth sat down across from him. She set her hands flat on the table, those strong, practical hands, and she looked at him for a long time. "You would do this," she said. "For 40 acres that aren't yours and children you've known a week." "For 40 acres that are yours," he said, "and children who deserve to keep them." She was quiet. "Then, your wife." "Eleanor." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Yes. Thomas told me there's a marker behind the big pine. Yes. Would you feel you were dishonouring her? He thought about this for a long time. The fire ticked. Outside, a jay called once and then was silent. Eleanor was practical, he finally said. More practical than me, most things. I believe she would look at this situation and tell me I was being an idiot if I didn't fix it the only way it can be fixed. He almost smiled. She had a low tolerance for people choosing symbolic gestures over useful ones. Ruth made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. A short one, surprised out of her, quickly contained. She put her hand over her mouth. He looked at her. She lowered her hand. All right, she said. But on one condition. Name it. You eat breakfast inside. Every morning. You are not a barn animal and I will not feed you like one. He looked at her. That's your condition. That is my condition. Done, he said. Magistrate Hollis performed the ceremony on a Thursday, in the Land Registry office. With Fenwick Hobbs as witness and Thomas standing straight-backed in his best shirt and May holding persimmon under one arm with the solemnity of a flower girl who has substituted a cat for flowers. And sees no issue with this. Hobbs filed the deed transfer the same afternoon. Title to the Callaway 40 acres passed to Ruth Cord, née Callaway. Clear. Unambiguous. Legal as stone. Cabe Weiler arrived in Cresswell 2 days later with his lawyer. He was told of the marriage and the transfer at Hobbs's counter, and Harlan watched him receive the information, watched his face go through several expressions before settling on the flat. Smooth blankness of a man recalculating an investment he's decided isn't worth the cost. His lawyer spent an hour reviewing the documents. Then he told Weiler, quietly, that the easement claim had no viable purchase on a clear title deed. That pursuing it further would cost more than the mineral rights were worth. That it was over. Weiler stood in the street outside the registry office and looked at Harlan. Harlan looked back. There was a long moment in which all the territory between them, what each man wanted, what each man would and would not do, was silently, completely understood. Weiler turned, walked to his horse, and rode south. He did not come back. The shift in Cresswell came the way most shifts do, not with a declaration but with an accumulation of small, ordinary things. The blacksmith's wife brought a pie to the Cord place the following week. The schoolteacher stopped Ruth in the street to ask when May might start in the schoolroom. The minister mentioned, in a sermon that touched obliquely on the subject without touching it directly, that the mark of a community was how it treated its most vulnerable. And the families who answered that call were the ones the valley would remember. Mrs. Aldine Pruitt held out the longest, as persons of her particular temperament always do, finding social opinion changing beneath her like a floorboard going soft. Until one Tuesday at the general store she found herself in the position of complimenting Ruth's preserves. Ruth had brought a jar for the merchant's wife, a genuine gesture of thanks. And the compliment was entirely sincere, which surprised her considerably. She told her husband that evening that she'd always thought Ruth Cord had good sense. Her husband said nothing. He had learned, over 40 years of marriage, when silence was the correct instrument. The baby came in January, in the coldest week of the year, when the creek froze to its bed and the snow lay so deep on the roof that Harlan climbed up twice a day to clear it. And the house held all of them close in the amber light of the lamps. The midwife came from town through the snow, and Thomas sat with Harlan in the kitchen the whole of the night, and neither of them slept and neither of them admitted they were frightened. And they played cards badly and drank coffee until the sky went grey and the midwife appeared in the doorway and said it was done, and it was a girl, and Ruth was well. Thomas put his head down on the table and breathed out a long slow breath that carried about 3 months of held fear in it. Harlan looked at the ceiling and felt something in his chest come quietly unknotted, a thing he hadn't known was still tied. He went to the doorway of the bedroom and looked in. Ruth sat propped against the pillow, the baby against her chest, small and red and alive. May was already on the bed beside her mother, one finger extended for the baby to hold. The lamp put everything in gold. Ruth looked up and found his eyes. There are things that do not require language. There are understandings that happen in the marrow of a person, below the level of words, conducted in the frequencies of shared darkness and shared mourning and bread broken at the same table. In the language of wood stacked by the door and a window latch that has been repaired and a child who has learned to trust again. They were not the same people they had been. Neither of them would be again. But a broken axle on a mountain road, in the bone cold of an October morning, had cracked open something in both of them that had needed the air. And what grew in that cracked place did not grow fast, and was not showy, and did not announce itself. It grew the way the hardiest things grow, low to the ground, roots deep, patient past all reason. Come spring, Thomas and Harlan broke the ground on the Callaway 40 together. The soil was dark and rich and smelled like everything that was going to happen. They planted it. There are people who come into our lives at the exact moment of breaking, when the axle is cracked and the mud is deep and the sky carries winter in it. They don't always come with softness. They come with a wagon and a practical offer and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided, without fanfare, that you are worth the trouble. This is the oldest kind of love, not the kind written in letters, but the kind written in mornings. In meals. In staying. Remember that.